welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is seen nationwide. The topic for today's show is evolution and the intelligent design debate. While many Americans thought the debate about evolution and creationism ended more than 80 years ago with the decision in the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee, the modern theory of intelligent design has brought the debate back to the courtroom, the public consciousness, the political sphere, and to the halls of academia. Today, those on the side of evolution argue that if the teaching of intelligent design belongs in the classroom at all, it belongs in philosophy or religion classrooms, not science classrooms. The evolutionists, adherents of Charles Darwin's evolution through the process of natural selection, say that intelligent design proponents take the Bible too literally. On the other hand, intelligent designers argue that Darwin's evolution is merely theory, and certain aspects of natural selection and evolution simply cannot be explained in the absence of an intelligent designer. Intelligent design proponents argue that materialists and naturalists prevent students from obtaining a complete picture of how different life forms came into being. Joining me for this discussion are Dr. Barbara Forrest, professor of philosophy at Southeastern Louisiana University. Dr. Forrest co-authored with Paul Gross the 2004 book Creationism's Trojan Horse, The Wedge of Intelligent Design. Dr. Forrest was one of the key plaintiff's witnesses in the Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District case decided in December 2005. And Professor David K. DeWolf, professor of law at Gonzaga University School of Law. Professor DeWolf is a fellow of the Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. He has co-authored Intelligent Design in Public School Science Curricula, a legal guidebook, and he has written a critique of the Kitzmiller case entitled Traipsing into Evolution, Intelligent Design in the Kitzmiller versus Dover Decision. And last but not least, Dr. Kenneth R. Miller is a cell biologist and a professor of biology at Brown University. In addition, he has written articles that have appeared in numerous scientific journals and magazines, including Nature, Scientific American, Cell, and Discover. It was Dr. Miller's 1999 book, Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, which led me to want to have him on this panel. Thank you all for joining me. My name is Kurt Olson, a professor at the Massachusetts School of Law and your host for today's show. Well, after that exceedingly lengthy introduction, we can get started. Dr. Miller, I mentioned the Scopes trial at the beginning in my introduction. I was wondering if you could give us a little background for those of our viewers who don't even know what I'm talking about.
Well, the Scopes trial was really one of the most famous trials in American history. And it took place in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, and it involved a Tennessee law that forbid the teaching of any theory, any doctrine in the public schools that contradicted the divine origin, the biblical origin of the human species. Essentially, it was a setup. And what I mean by a setup is that prosecutors and defense attorneys from the ACLU were looking for a test case by which the law could be challenged or upheld in a court of law. Mm-hmm. And they found a willing victim, if you will, in John Scopes, a sort of part-time high school biology teacher who agreed to serve as the defendant to be charged under the law. The media assembled in a way that I think had few precedents in American history in terms of making this a national case. The noted commentator H.L. Mencken wrote regular diaries from the trial that were published in newspapers around the country. The defense attorney defending Scopes was Clarence Darrow. The prosecutor who came in specially for the occasion was William Jennings Bryan, several times an unsuccessful candidate for president of the United States and a national political figure in his own right. The trial was exceptional for several reasons, one of which was that the judge excluded scientific testimony, although both sides were really ready to do it. He said, let's focus on the issue. So the highlights of the trial really were the point at which William Jennings Bryan allowed himself to be placed on the witness stand as an expert witness on the Bible, allowing himself to be cross-examined by Clarence Darrow. The verdict in the trial was guilty as charged. A fine of $100 was assessed to John Scopes, and that verdict was later set aside on a technicality. And the technicality, as I understand it, not being an attorney, was that Tennessee law at the time required that all fines in excess of $50 be assessed by a jury. And since it had been assessed by a judge, the fine was set aside. But the fact remains that Scopes was found guilty, and that law stayed on the books in the state of Tennessee until 1967.
Interesting. Grand theater, as it were, in a
Oh,
sense.
absolutely. And of course, it served as the basis for a fictionalized account of a not identical trial in the play and later on the movie Inherit the Wind.
Professor DeWolf, I believe you wrote in your book about an Edmund or Edward Larson who essentially took issue with Inherit the Wind and its depiction of the Scopes monkey trial.
Right. There are a lot of historical anomalies between the two. And I think to the extent, one thing that does somewhat ring true is the idea that this was a made-up case to try to put a big issue and cram it into this small courtroom. But again, Inherit the Wind was written with ideological implications in the 50s. It had its own axe to grind and was not an accurate, as Ken said, it's not an accurate portrayal of what actually happened at the trial.
Barbara, could you give us somewhat of a philosophical perspective on Inherit the Wind, the Scopes monkey trial, what it meant in terms of the culture? Because you have spoken a lot, written a lot about fundamentalism and how it relates to this whole issue.
Oh, I think it reflected the real fear that a certain segment of the American religious population has with the whole topic of evolution. In the early part of the 20th century, a little set of pamphlets called the Fundamentals was written. It's where we get the word fundamentalist, and it set down the requirements for being a good and faithful Christian. And of course, the topic of evolution represents to a segment of the religious community everything about the modern world that they fear and that they dislike. And I think that the whole aura around the film and around the whole subject of the Scopes trial captures at least that accurately, that there is a real dislike of the whole topic of evolutionary theory among people who have not been able to make the accommodation to modern science for religious reasons.
Dave, I know that you've taken issue with the whole notion, I believe, in Judge Jones' decision in Kitzmiller, especially about how he's tied that directly to fundamentalism. Give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, the reason that this is a bad place to begin, that is the Inherit the Wind stereotype as we refer to it, is that in that situation, and as Barbara was just saying, if you portray it as a conflict between religion and science, you fundamentally misunderstand the modern controversy. The modern controversy is between two different scientific views. Michael Behe, who's one of the scientists working on the intelligent design theory, had no religious issues with the Darwinian theory. He had learned it in graduate school, assumed it to be true, and his work as a biochemist was trying to follow up on it and discovered there were big scientific problems, and that's what launched him into his work. So again, to the extent that this is portrayed as sort of Scopes redux, it really misunderstands the nature of the modern controversy.
I see. Ken, just again as background for our viewers who probably don't understand or might not remember their 7th or 9th grade biology class, what is evolution? At some point in your book you described it as a modest idea, a minimal concept, really just 2 points. What are those points?
Well, those 2 points. First, actually, I want to take issue with something that David said.
Sure.
He immediately said, this is not a religious issue. It's a conflict between two groups of scientists. One of the things that came out in great clarity at the Dover v. Kitzmiller trial was that all of the motivations of the members of the Board of Education, from their public comments to their individual memos to their emails, were religious in nature. And to be perfectly honest, what they wanted to teach in Dover High School, and they made this clear with their public comments, was a version of religious creationism, or as they called it, creation science. They very quickly realized they couldn't do this. They started calling it something else. That was intelligent design. But in part of the substantive conclusion of Judge Jones in that trial was that it was very clear that intelligent design, no matter how much it stresses science, as David just says, no matter how much it stresses science, it cannot decouple itself from its creationist roots. So it's not. I take issue with his characterization. The two essential parts of evolution are really straightforward, and it really is a simple idea. and that is that there exists variation in nature among individuals in a species. And you can see that very clearly. I mean, look at the 4 representatives of our species at this table. There's plenty of variation here, and there's plenty of variation out there in the real world, and you'll certainly see that in other organisms. And then the second is the observation that among that variation, there is differential reproductive success, which is to say some individuals leave more offspring than others, and that's also very clear. The combination of those two, also given the input of new variation into a species, which Darwin observed, and today we can understand right down to the molecular level, means that a species is going to be subject to a kind of selection over time. Darwin was familiar with artificial selection, by which plant and animal breeders basically selected for certain characteristics. His great insight was to understand that nature does selecting too, and that selection is reflected in differential reproductive success. So those two ideas, a constant input of variation and the selective power of nature, combine to basically produce the process of evolution by which the characteristics, the average characteristics of a species change over time, and by which a species can split into 2 or 3 independent groups, giving rise to new species.
I see. Barbara, one of the things that I found very interesting about the life of Charles Darwin was that he had really developed the germ of the idea of evolution, and he waited about 20 years before he actually published it. Can you explain why it was that he did that? What were the circumstances surrounding his life, the time that he lived, and his relationship to the Anglican Church that led him to keep it a secret?
Well, first, the idea of evolution had been around for a long time. Darwin's unique contribution was that he developed an explanation for how it happens, and that's evolution by natural selection. And Darwin himself had gone through his own process of change. When he boarded the Beagle as a very young man, one of the books he had with him was the Bible, because he accepted, loved William Paley's watch argument. William Paley's book, The Natural Theology, 1802, had almost memorized it, and he was a lifelong believer in the teachings of the church about special creation. His ideas began to change as he saw the data that he was accumulating. When he figured out the process of natural selection, he knew that this would be upsetting to a great many people. Having been through his own process of changing his mind.
Referred to it, I think, in one of his books as akin to a murder.
He knew that this would be upsetting to a lot of people, and he sat on it for 20 years, and he just did research, and he gathered more and more data. He wanted to make sure that he could defend this idea, but the reason that he sat on it for such a long time was, one of the reasons was his wife, whom he dearly loved, and she was devoutly religious. And he did not want to cause her any more, he was concerned for her religious sensitivity. And also people that he knew, his friends, and other scientists. He also knew of people who had literally been jailed for departing from certain scriptural understandings in England, and he was concerned about that. But he did give his wife permission to publish this if he should die, publish it after his death. But he went ahead and published it when he realized that he was about to be scooped by Alfred Russel Wallace, who had figured it out on his own. But he was concerned about the feelings of people that he did not want to upset.
I see. The culture in general at that time.
Yes.
Ken, giving you a chance to respond to, Dave, giving you a chance to respond to Ken's earlier comment. What is ID? What is intelligent design, and what are the scientific underpinnings as you understand them?
Well, I'd first of all agree with much of what Ken described in terms of evolution, that the process by which variation allows species to adapt, in some cases to form new groups that can't interbreed with other groups. All of this is well accepted. That's not the controversial part of the evolutionary theory. The real question is, how do you get the first of a new capability in nature? And the concept of design itself is not unique to biology. There are lots of cosmologists, physicists, and so forth who look at the finely tuned aspects of the universe and basically infer from that, or pose the question, gee, this looks so wonderfully engineered that should we not suggests the possibility that this was a design system rather than something that just randomly fell into place. As applied to the, and design is also widely used in other scientific fields to identify those phenomena which are the result of human or intelligent agency, as distinguished from those things that can arise from natural processes. Now, applied to biology, the question that Michael Behe raised was, gee, I can't find in the research that I'm doing a plausible explanation for the development of highly complex, interrelated, what he called irreducibly complex structures. And since design has been identified by people like Richard Dawkins, a strong proponent of Darwinian evolution, since that kind of, since the idea of design as identified by Dawkins is a hallmark of biology, is it possible that design is real rather than merely illusory, as he suggests? So that's the application of intelligent design to the biological sphere.
Ken, in response to that, I think there were three things that Dr. Behe wrote about. What was it? The immune system, blood clotting, and the flagellum of certain bacteria.
That's right.
I'm getting way out of my element now, but
No,
as
but
you can probably tell.
with all due respect for attorney, you're doing just fine.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. How is it that you've disproved all of those things that Dr. Behe would suggest? Well, we can't really explain this based on evolutionary theory alone. There must be a designer.
Well, it's very important to give credit to Dr. Behe's arguments and to state them properly. Michael Behe has indeed looked around and said, I don't think that modern molecular biology, biochemistry, and genetics can explain this, that, and the other thing. If that's all he had said, there wouldn't be much of a theory there, because there's an awful lot of things in this world. Friction is an example. The movement apart of chromosomes during cell division. We don't understand the basic force-generating mechanism. There's an awful lot of things that we don't understand in science. But what Dr. Behe said was not only that I don't understand this, but I've discovered a reason why these complex systems are unevolvable, an ironclad reason why they could not be produced by evolution. And that is that they're composed of multiple parts. And none of these parts have any function until they are all fully assembled and put together. He calls this property irreducible complexity. Now, if he was right about that, in other words, if we could look at these systems and discover that, yes, all of the multiple parts with no functions of their own had to be put together before there was any selectable function, he might have a very good reason for saying that these structures are unevolvable. And that's not evidence for design. That's evidence against evolution. Design evidence is inevitably negative, as is this. But the problem is, and this came out in the Kitzmiller trial, every single case that he has advanced that way has turned out to be wrong. Examples. He predicted 10 years ago that we would never get a Darwinian explanation for the gene shuffling system that makes it possible for us to make hundreds of thousands of antibodies against any conceivable pathogen that might infect us. Well, it turns out in the 10 years since he made that statement, that's exactly what immunologists have figured out. And in fact, when Behe was testifying at the trial, 58 papers, research papers, were piled up in front of him, every one of them filling another piece of the puzzle as to how this evolution took place. And he simply said this wasn't good enough evidence for him. With the blood clotting system, he said all of these proteins have to be present before you clot any blood. Well, it turns out we've investigated the genomes of other organisms, and we found, for example, although it's a strange sounding example, that the puffer fish is missing 3 of these important components, and its blood clots just fine. And with respect to the bacterial flagellum, it has about 35 proteins, depending upon the species. There are subsets of proteins in there with different functions. And I think for the benefit of your non-scientific audience, I've got a very simple little demonstration. And I'll use Dr. Behe's favorite example of an irreducibly complex system, and that is a mousetrap.
Could you save that until after the next break?
I'd be happy to, or until we see a mouse in the studio.
Excellent. We'll look for the mouse. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us. Today we're discussing evolution and intelligent design. We'll be right back. we're back on the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Today we're discussing evolution and intelligent design, and prior to the break, Dr. Miller was getting ready to show us a demonstration. If you'd go ahead.
Absolutely. I have in my hand a very simple mousetrap, and this is actually Dr. Behe's favorite example, mechanical example of irreducible complexity. A mousetrap, of course, is designed to catch mice. And it has 5 parts. It has a little catch over here, it has a spring and a hammer, it has a bait holder, and it has the plate. And this is said by Dr. Behe to be irreducibly complex, because if any of these parts are missing, you can't catch any mice with it. And that's a perfectly valid point. He would argue the same thing happens in these micro machines that we see inside the cell. Can't catch any mice with them. And the point is that all the parts have to be assembled before you have any functionality. Now, there's an interesting thing. He's been making this argument for 10 years. It hasn't generated a single research publication that has even used the word irreducible complexity. It just hasn't impressed the scientific community. Why is that? Well, I think the answer is because the concept is wrong. And you can even use the mousetrap to show why it's wrong. I'm wearing a tie clip that looks like it's composed of a mousetrap. Now, it's not very elegant, but it does keep my tie in place. But what you'll see when I take this out is that this is a mousetrap from which I've removed 2 of the parts. I've removed the catch and the base holder. You can't catch any mice with this. But these 3 parts of the 5-part mousetrap are perfectly functional in a different context. And one context would be holding my tie on, another context would be serving as a large paperclip, and a final context that one of my friends used in high school would be as a viciously effective spitball launcher. And the point about all of this is this sort of functionality within the complicated system is actually something that we see biochemically at the level of the cell. So the central idea, and it is the core idea of intelligent design, this irreducible complexity, no pathway to evolution, turns out to be wrong. And it turns out to be wrong in every one of the cases that the advocates of intelligent design themselves have cited. That was very clear in the trial. It's been very clear in the scientific community. And that's why this idea, in terms of science, has literally gone nowhere.
Dave, I know that you have talked before about how there are a number of research papers, in fact, that have been published. And in responding to Ken, I was wondering if you could let us know what some of those are.
Sure. And I wish Michael Behe had been invited to be a scientific complement to this. I'm just a lawyer. I've tried to understand what I can about this. But what I can say is this. First of all, Ken and Michael Behe debated this very issue in a book published by the Cambridge University Press called Debating Design. This is a scientific debate that's going on. It's going on in very respectable places. Ken would also have to admit that he's a partisan. He's a Red Sox partisan, I understand, among other things. And when the Red Sox play the Yankees, they're out to beat the Yankees. And it's understandable that Ken is out to show that Michael Behe is wrong. But the point is that this is a scientific debate. And what was at stake in the Dover case should have been actually the narrow question whether this 90-second statement was unconstitutional. And it may be, as Ken said, that the people who put this statement forward had unconstitutional motives for putting it in. But that would no more establish the constitutionality of teaching intelligent design or the unconstitutionality of teaching intelligent design than if I hired a Norwegian for prejudicial reasons and you drew the conclusion that it was unconstitutional to hire Norwegians. It simply doesn't follow. The point, though, is that there is a scientific debate. Michael Behe has responded to all of the criticisms of his theory, and this is the way that science normally progresses through debate, through partisanship. That's fine. But there's no reason why you should characterize what Michael Behe is doing as being something other than a scientific venture.
Now,
Thank you.
let me jump into this, because this is a very important point, because the whole strategy of the Discovery Institute has been to argue that there's a debate in scientific community. Well, there's not much of a debate, for the very simple reason that the overwhelming weight of opinion, about 99.9% of working scientists certainly agree that these arguments have gone nowhere. And Dr. Behe, on the stand, under oath, in the Dover trial, admitted that he hadn't produced any research papers that even mentioned irreducible complexity or intelligent design.
But I think that Dave said that as part of his amicus curiae brief, there were something like 80 scientists or more than 80 scientists
But the
signed
interesting
on
thing,
to his
thing
brief, right?
about Dave's amicus curiae brief is that he filed as an expert witness to the trial, and then he withdrew. He was not willing to come to court and be cross-examined.
You're not speaking of me. I was never.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have you confused with the other people from the Discovery Institute who were withdrawn from the trial. But here's the interesting point. If the way in which the scientific community settles controversial issues, as Dave quite rightly said, the way in which they settle them is by argument and debate within the scientific community. What is unusual, and what was unconstitutional in the Dover case, is to have one side appeal to the power of government to basically do an end run around science, ask for an intellectual subsidy, and basically say, no, we can't convince the scientific community, so we want to use the agencies and levers of government to force our point of view into the school classroom. And that has been the whole strategy behind intelligent design. And that's one of the reasons why courts say, gee, you don't want to wait for the normal scientific process to work. You want to use the levers of government to force your idea. Why? And the why turns out to be a religious motivation.
If
I did, just let me get to Barbara for a second. I did, by the way, invite Professor Behe to be on the show, and he declined. And by way of continuing the baseball analogy, I would say that you're doing a great job as a pinch hitter. So, meanwhile, Barbara, I was wondering that one of the things that the people, proponents of intelligent design, would claim is that what they're trying to do is debunk the materialistic in science. Can you respond to whether or not that's true and why it's wrong if they're not correct?
One of the complaints of creationists against science has always been that it's materialistic, right?
Mm-hmm. And by materialistic, you mean something different than what I'm thinking of, like I'd like to buy a new car today.
Right, it's very different, yeah. There are a couple of things that need to be distinguished, okay. There is a philosophical viewpoint, an understanding of the world that is called materialism. It's very ancient, goes all the way back to the Greeks. Mm-hmm. And that simply is the idea that the material world and what emanates from the material world and its processes is the whole of reality. That there is, and of course that does not include the supernatural. Mm-hmm. So materialism as a comprehensive metaphysics is a view that excludes the supernatural. Okay? Okay. Science is not that. Science is not a metaphysics. Science is a methodology, mm-hmm. right? That has enabled us to understand the natural world. Science has no choice except to deal with the material world, right? The physical world and the processes associated with it. Mm-hmm. The creationists and other people who cannot accept evolutionary theory paint the materialistic nature of science, its methodology, as something evil, as something which undercuts religious faith, as something that generates all of the evils of the modern world, which is a fairly preposterous proposition. Mm-hmm. But science has no choice except to deal with the world as they find it. We live in a physical world. Mm-hmm. And the creationists constantly conflate the methodology of science, which is more properly called a naturalistic methodology, mm-hmm. which means that scientists look for natural explanations for the natural world, right? A fancy term for that is methodological naturalism. Mm-hmm. The intelligent design creationists conflate that with the idea that the comprehensive understanding of reality called philosophical naturalism, which is a materialistic worldview, mm-hmm. right? That the supernatural does not exist. They are not the same. Science behaves, or scientists conduct themselves as though nothing else existed. Why? Because there is no epistemology for knowing the supernatural. There is no methodology for showing that there is a epistemology or a methodology. The creationists, though, would have people think that the methodology of science is exactly the same, that it commits people to rejecting a belief in God, which is not the case at all. There are millions of counterexamples walking around who will tell you that they accept modern science, they also live meaningful religious lives. That's the objection to materialism.
I see. Dave, I know there were a few things that Barbara said and that Ken had said earlier that you probably wanted to respond
Sure.
to. I noticed the term evil was used, so I figured you would like to get to that.
Just to respond to what Barbara said, first of all, take a guy like Michael Behe. He certainly doesn't argue that science is evil. He's a scientist. That's what he does, and it is his pursuit of scientific questions that led him to pose the issue of design. And I think it's erroneous to suggest that design necessarily entails the supernatural. Again, as I said earlier, scientists very frequently employ a kind of common sense or even methodological process to identify what is likely to have come from natural causes and what is likely to be the result of an intelligent agent. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the so-called SETI program, which was popularized in the movie Contact, that process looks to the heavens, so to speak, for signs of intelligence. And the idea is that if you detect certain kinds of patterns that are normally associated with the sorts of things that intelligent agents do, then we would identify that as the product of extraterrestrial intelligence. By contrast, there are many other signals that might sound like a pattern, but on closer inspection we find out they're just some variation that's a result of natural causes. So it is not true to suggest that the only alternative to a search for material causes is to look to the supernatural. We frequently have the process of exploring the possibility that something's either the result of a natural, unguided process or it's the result of an intelligent agent's intervention.
Ken, part of your book, actually, I believe the subtitle, it talks about how you as a devout Catholic can continue to practice your religion and believe in God at the same time that you believe in evolutionary theory. Does that suggest that there might be some support for what Dave says, or is it complete bunk?
I wouldn't. I extend too much courtesy to my friend to use the word bunk.
Okay.
First of all, my faith is certainly something I believe in. Evolution isn't something I believe in. I don't believe in evolution. I don't believe in the Krebs cycle. I don't believe in atomic orbital theory. I accept those last three things as the best scientific explanation of the basis of the data. That's my own understanding of evolution. I certainly find it to be tremendously compatible with my religious belief, literally in every way. And that's one of the reasons I wrote that book. And it turns out this is really the general consensus within the scientific community. Next month, Francis Collins, a devout Christian and the head of the Human Genome Project, one of the most famous scientists in the world, probably on the short list for the Nobel Prize, is going to publish a new book on science and faith. And he makes a very, very frank confession of his faith in this book. And as an aside, very, very strongly defends the theory of evolution because, as he points out, the interpretation of genome data that we do every day in analyzing the human genome and other genomes would be impossible without evolution as the tool to guide us. The other point is that Dave just mentioned that we've heard Dr. Behe's name again and again, that the belief or acceptance of the idea of design doesn't imply that the designer is supernatural. Well, one of the really interesting things about the Dover trials that there were 3 expert witnesses for the side defending intelligent design of the Dover Board of Education. Every one of those expert witnesses in court said the designer had to be supernatural. Dr. Behe said it was implausible, not believable, that the designer could be natural, therefore he had to be supernatural. Scott Minnick said, a microbiology professor from the University of Idaho, said that for intelligent design to be considered science, we have to change the ground rules of science to include the supernatural. And Stephen William Fuller, another expert witness for the defense in this case, said like the entire project of ID, its whole goal is to change the ground rules of science to make supernatural ideas an accepted part of science. So the notion that designer doesn't imply the supernatural actually was refuted not by us, not by expert witnesses on our side, but by the very scientists and expert witnesses whom David was citing.
Barbara, we've spoken before a little bit about Dembski, I believe his name is, and he talks about how there are certain mathematical implications that might explain something about design theory. Is any of that credible based on the research that you've done? Because your book is highly footnoted and very well researched.
Yes. Let me say one thing about Dr. Dembski's work that speaks to one of the things that David said. Dr. Dembski himself defined the designer as a supernatural, transcendent designer. He very specifically said that in an article he wrote in 1992. He specified it himself, and so we don't, and the minute that the intelligent design proponents reject naturalism, that is exactly the same as an endorsement of the supernatural because there is no other alternative. What William Dembski has done is to really use the same technique that some of the earlier creationists like Henry Morris have done, is to try to show that the odds, the mathematical odds that certain let's say structures like the bacterial flagellum could form by natural processes are so overwhelmingly against it that we may as well conclude that that's tantamount to saying it didn't happen. Some of his critics call that his mathematicisms, but it's essentially the same old creationist technique of trying to use mathematics to show that the odds are overwhelmingly against the natural formation of these little structures. But they did form, and they did form naturally. And the research is actually being done to show how that could have happened. Dr. Dembski, I might add, has no formal credentials in science. He is not a scientist, although he purports to speak very often as a scientist. But essentially, his unique contribution is to defend intelligent design as part of his Christian apologetics. As a defense of Christianity, and he's written extensively about that.
Like to respond?
To that?
Absolutely.
First of all, Bill Dembski has a PhD in mathematics, which I believe qualifies as a science, as well as a PhD in philosophy. And his book, The Design Inference, was published by the Cambridge University Press. And the process of making the design inference is, as he describes, one that is common in a lot of different scientific endeavors. I don't think that part is being challenged. The question is whether you can apply this to the biological realm. Now, if what you're saying is we have to exclude any possibility of something other than a materialistic cause, if the nature, if the closed set in which we operate has to be a set of materialistic explanations, then you have by definition excluded any possibility of looking elsewhere.
Thank you, and we'll go to the next break, and when we come back, I'll let you continue that thought. Thank you for joining us. We're here today on MSL's Educational Forum discussing evolution and the intelligent design debate. Thanks for joining us. We'll be right back. And we're back with MSL's Educational Forum. Today we're discussing evolution and the intelligent design debate. And continuing with the debate, I offered Dave the opportunity to finish his thought prior to the last break. So Dave, can you continue on?
I was trying to explain the difference between the design inference, which basically says I can see from what I'm looking at the telltale characteristics of an intelligent agent, from the identification of who that agent is. Now, I would concede to Barbara that most of the people who have advocated intelligent design, if you ask, well, who do you think the designer is, they would identify that designer with some sort of deity associated with a traditional faith. But that's a second process by which you identify who the intelligent agent is. The first process, which scientists engage in independently, is to look at, for example, a fire. Did this fire start naturally, or was it set by arson? That's the determination you can make before you identify the intelligent agent who's involved.
I see. And Barbara, you were looking to respond to the question about Mr. or Professor Dembski?
Yes, well, a response to some of the things that David has said. First of all, William Dembski defines intelligent design as religion. He says that intelligent design is the Logos theology of John's Gospel restated in the idiom of information theory. Philip E. Johnson, who is the leader of this movement, defines intelligent design as theistic realism. They define it. They give its essential characteristic as a religious idea. The other thing I'd like to respond to is the idea that William Dembski has shown how intelligent design, or how he can explain how it applies to biological systems. He's never done it. He has been repeatedly asked to provide the data to show, for example, how his explanatory filter would work on a biological system. He's never been able to do it. He's never offered the data, even after saying that he would. And so he's really not been able to successfully accomplish what he says that he set out to do. With respect to his design inference, the book, The Design Inference, in September of 2003, he put it on a list of books that he presented to the Texas Board of Education when the Discovery Institute involved itself in a dispute over the selection of science books. He presented it to the Texas Board of Education as a book that supports the intelligent design. But only 2 months earlier, he himself had written that when he wrote The Design Inference, it did not address the question of biology. So he's directly contradicting himself there. The other thing that's very important here is when Professor DeWolf talks about intelligent design as it applies to biology, there's nothing to apply. Paul Nelson, who is one of Professor DeWolf's Discovery Institute colleagues, has said that the biggest problem they have right now is that they don't have a theory of biological design. They don't have one.
Thank you. Ken, we were talking earlier about how you debated with, I believe it was Henry Morris, the late Henry Morris,
Right.
in Tampa, Florida. I think it was soon after you'd become a professor at the University of Colorado, is that correct?
No, not quite. It was soon
Okay.
after I had come to Brown. My PhD is from the University of Colorado.
I see. Okay. At that time, I believe Mr. Morris was a creationist in the strictest form of the word.
Absolutely.
And yet you came away from that debate feeling like you admired the man for his conviction, and yet you were concerned about what his conviction would mean for morality and other issues.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I debated actually Henry Morris, who is the sort of the grand old man of scientific creationists in the United States, the founder of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego. I actually debated him 3 times in the early 1980s, once in Providence on my campus, once in Tampa, and another time in Arizona. And after the debate in Tampa, and the reason we did this was because the Board of Education in Tampa, Florida in 1982 had decided they wanted their kids to be taught scientific creationism. And they instructed the science departments to prepare a scientific creationist curriculum. And the science departments were just, deeply depressed and didn't want to do this. A large local Baptist megachurch in Tampa then decided they'd try to scare up somebody for a debate. And I was invited to go down and debate Morris. And because it was such an issue, we had this in the largest high school auditorium in Tampa. It drew 1,700 people. There was an overflow crowd of about 600 with closed circuit audio. It was carried live on a local radio station. So this turned out to be a big deal. I don't think Morris fared very well in the debate because they tried to organize another one about 6 months later to sort of undo the damage. But to me, the most revealing thing was that the next morning, they put both of us up in the same hotel. And the next morning, it was a Sunday morning, and I had gone to Mass early and then was coming back to have breakfast, and I saw Henry Morris in the coffee shop. He was finishing his breakfast. I figured, what the heck? I asked him if I could sit down. He said, sure. And I reminded him that some of the arguments that he had used had failed badly, and they had failed badly because I had shown how the arguments either were mistaken, or the data was misrepresented, or the more recent scientific data was on the side of evolution. And then I told him, I said, you don't really believe this stuff, do you? And I half wondered if he did. And it was apparent from his answer that he did, that he was a gentleman of conviction and of passion. And what he told me was basically, Ken, you're earnest, you're bright, but you have to realize something. And that is that even as scientists, we have to take the Word of God in Scripture as being true. And if for the moment scientific facts and data and evidence seem to contradict it, we have to set those aside in favor of what we regard as the greater truth. Now, I admire him in terms of conviction, but as a scientist and as a believer, I happen to think that faith and reason are both gifts from God. And therefore, ultimately, there ought not to be a conflict between science and religion. That really set me to thinking, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book that you cited earlier.
I see. Dave, I know one of the concerns among devout Christians is that a belief in evolution will eventually lead down this slippery slope that we lawyers like to use, where essentially morality and ethics and personal responsibility go out the window. How can we prevent that from happening and make it sort of jibe, make it still comport with notions of evolution and scientific theory?
Well, let me first find a little common ground with Ken Miller here, that I think that science has to pursue the scientific questions wherever they go. In fact, that's what we at the Discovery Institute have been arguing since we started on this project. And in fact, it's frequently people on the other side who want to put boundaries on where science can go because they want to constrain it in some way. And we say, let the evidence take you wherever it goes. Let's have a free and open discussion of this issue. What implications it has for religion or for anti-religion is not for the scientists to have to worry about. But I do think we have to recognize that there are implications that people do derive from scientific theories like the Big Bang, for example, or recently Anthony Flew, the famous atheist, a British philosopher atheist who was essentially convinced from studying DNA and reading Michael Behe's book, actually, that there was something more to the universe than purely material causes. There's no question that there are implications, whether it is someone who studies Darwin's theory of evolution and finds, gee, this is a more plausible explanation than some kind of creation story that I've heard. You can go either way on this. The point is that the science should not be held captive to the philosophical implications that people want to draw or are afraid to draw from the science. And that's a position the Discovery Institute has taken. It may be different from the kinds of debates that Ken has had in the past.
Professor DeWolf, Barbara complained in his book, Traipsing Toward Evolution, I believe it was, that part of the problem that he had with Judge Jones' decision was that he inquired into the motivation of those people who testified on behalf of intelligent design, but he failed to inquire into motivations of the witnesses on behalf of the plaintiffs, in particular you. I guess Dave just mentioned that atheism enters into this picture, and how is it that you can square your religious beliefs, whatever they happen to be, with evolution, and why should the judge not inquire into your motivations?
I've never made my religious beliefs an issue, unlike the people at the Discovery Institute.
Okay.
It is they who have made religious belief an issue because they talk about it at every turn. They have defined intelligent design in terms of religion. They have explained that there's a document called the Wedge Strategy. It is a planning document, a tactical document that was drawn up for fundraising purposes by the Discovery Institute. And it explains its strategy over a period of 20 years. That strategy is explained in overtly religious language. So, and when you don't have a science program, and when you don't have any research, and when you have a scientist like Michael Behe, who has never, ever incorporated the use of intelligent design into his professional work as a biochemist, you have to look at the only thing these people have, and that is their religious motives and their religious goals, which they have made the issue. It is the flaw in the criticism that they are making against me is that I have never made religion an issue. It is they who have done that. What I have done, and why they tried to keep me out of the trial, why the other side tried to keep me off the bench, the witness stand, is because I just simply tell people what the Discovery Institute creationists themselves have said. It is they who make religion an issue, not me.
I see. Ken, I was wondering, do you have a particular complaint with what was the subject of the Kitzmiller case? I guess there was an announcement that the school board suggested that biology teachers in the 9th grade ought to read to students. And basically it said evolution is just a theory, it's not a fact, and then it went on to say that, by the way, if you'd like to look up this notion of intelligent design, you can do that, and there's a book called Of Pandas and People. What's the problem with that from a constitutional standpoint or from a scientific standpoint?
Well, sure. Not being a constitutional lawyer, I'll just tell you what I think as an American citizen, the problem with it. It was a 4-paragraph statement. And the school teachers in Dover, there's only 4 of them, biology teachers in Dover, refused to read it. And the reason they refused to read it is because they pointed out that to become teachers in the state of Pennsylvania, they had to sign on to the Pennsylvania Teacher Code of Ethics. And one part of that was a promise in which the teacher said that they would never knowingly present false information to a student. They said this statement is loaded with false information. We would violate our oath. Therefore, the board instructed the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, to go into the schools and read the statement to the classes, all 4 paragraphs, while the teacher stood out in the hallway, basically. And the way those 4 paragraphs read is very interesting. First of all, it tells students, we're required to teach you about evolution because it's in the Pennsylvania state standard, sort of we don't want to do this, but we gotta. The second thing is it reminds students that evolution is just a theory and it's filled with gaps and contradictions and there's all sorts of problems. Then it tells them, by the way, there is this other really great theory called intelligent design. The statement had lots of criticism of evolution and misrepresentation, but not a single criticism of intelligent design, as if it was the hot new thing. It mentioned that there were 2 classroom sets of this book, Pandas and People, in the library. Go read it if you want to find out. And then it concluded that, by the way, we got to test you on the evolution because it's in the state standards, just to remind kids with that. Now, what's the problem with that? I can see at least 3 problems. The first thing is basically what it tells students is that there are these 2 ideas you could consider, and students would understand right away. One of these is your Bible-friendly theory. The other one is hostile to religion, and that's evolution. And by the way, evolution is filled with holes. So first of all, it undermines evolution in a false way. And then it puts these 2 ideas in contradiction. Students aren't stupid. They're going to immediately realize that what they're being told is either if you pursue science, turn your back on your faith. Or if you want to keep your religious convictions, turn your back on mainstream science because you can't really trust it.
Thanks,
and follow
Ken.
this sort of thing.
I'd like to get to Dave's response to that since we're coming close to the end.
Sure, the Discovery Institute was never in favor of the policy that the Dover School Board adopted for a lot of the reasons that Ken mentioned, that is the opposition of the teachers to the policy, the fact that it wasn't a fair statement of the state of the scientific debate over evolution. But we think in a positive sum game here, which education should be, this debate should serve to motivate students to learn more about DNA, to learn more about the mechanisms by which cells operate. If we're going to do that, we need to give them a fair description of this scientific debate. And our criticism of Judge Jones was that he wasn't moving in that direction. And we think that that's where ultimately the law will go, is to encourage a full and fair debate of the scientific questions that are involved.
And Barbara, to you for a last thought, why is it that this is a problem? In a fair world, shouldn't we present both these views?
You've just seen a very good example of the strategy because Professor DeWolf is part of it, despite the fact that intelligent design has been thoroughly exposed as a religious belief in the words of its own proponents, and that its scientific claims have been thoroughly debunked. He still stays on the talking point, on message, that this is a scientific debate. And so this is a perfect example, and this has been going on in creationism for 40 years. No matter what you present scientifically, they don't accept it and they stay right on target.
Dave, back to you for one last thought.
Well, I would invite people to go to the Discovery Institute website. In particular, look for the MP3 files of a debate between Steve Meyer and Peter Ward, a biologist and astrobiologist at the University of Washington. It's a great chance to learn more about this issue.
Thanks for joining us. We've had a great show today. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time on the Educational Forum.